But the triumphs of the Valley Campaign were not due alone to the orders issued by Lee and Jackson. The Confederate troops displayed extraordinary endurance. When the stragglers were eliminated, their stancher comrades proved themselves true as steel. In every engagement the regiments fought with stubborn courage. They sometimes failed to break the enemy's line at the first rush, but, except at Kernstown, the Federals never drove them from their position, and Taylor's advance at Winchester, Trimble's counterstroke at Cross Keys, the storming of the battery at Port Republic, and the charge of the cavalry at Cedarville were the deeds of brave and resolute men. A retreat is the most exhausting of military movements. It is costly in men, more so, says Napoleon, than 2 battles, and it shakes the faith of the soldiers in their general and in themselves. Jackson's army retreated for 7 days before Fremont, dwindling in numbers at every step, and yet it never fought better than when it turned at bay. From first to last it believed itself superior to its enemies. From first to last it was equal to the tasks which its exacting commander imposed upon it, and its spirit was indomitable throughout. 1 mail a week and 3 foits a day, according to one of Jackson's Irishmen, was the rule in the campaigns of 1862. The forced marches were not made in luxury. Not seldom only half rations were issued, and more often none at all. The weather for many days in succession was abominable, and the forest bivouacs were comfortless in the extreme. On May 25th, 20% of Trimble's brigade went into action barefoot, and had it not been for the stores captured in Winchester, the march to the Potomac, and the subsequent unmolested retreat to Woodstock, would have been hardly possible. If the troops were volunteers, weak in discipline and prone to straggling, they nonetheless bore themselves with conspicuous gallantry. Their native characteristics came prominently to the front. Patient under hardships, vigorous in attack and stubborn in defence, they showed themselves worthy of their commander. Their enthusiastic patriotism was not without effect on their bearing before the enemy. Every private in the ranks believed that he was fighting in the sacred cause of liberty, and the spirit which nerved the resolution of the Confederate soldier was the same which inspired the resistance of their revolutionary forefathers. His hatred of the Yankee, as he contemptuously styled the Northerner, was even more bitter than the wrath which Washington's soldiers felt towards England, and it was intensified by the fact that his detested foeman had not only dared to invade the South, but had proclaimed his intention in no uncertain tones of dealing with the sovereign states exactly as he pleased. But it was something more than native courage and enthusiastic patriotism which inspired the barefooted heroes of Winchester. It would be difficult to prove that in other parts of the theatre of war the Confederate troops were inferior to those that held the valley. Yet they were certainly less successful, and in very many instances they had failed to put forth the same resolute energy as the men who followed Jackson. But it is hardly possible to discuss the spirit of an army apart from that of its commander. If, in strategy wholly and in tactics in great part, success emanates from a single brain, the moral of the troops is not less dependent on the influence of one man. "Better an army of stags," runs the old proverb, "led by a lion, than an army of lions led by a stag." Their leader's character had already made a sensible impression on the Valley soldiers. Jackson was as untheatrical as Wellington. He was hardly to be distinguished, even by his dress, from the private in the ranks. Soon after his arrival at Richmond, he called on Mrs. Pendleton, the wife of the Reverend Captain of the Rockbridge Battery. The Negro servant left him standing in the hall, thinking that this quiet soldier, clad in a faded and sunburnt uniform, need not be treated with further ceremony. Headquarters in camp were an ordinary bell tent or a room in the nearest cottage, and they were often without guard or sentry. In bivouac, the general rolled himself in his blankets and lay down under a tree or in a fence corner. He could sleep anywhere, in the saddle, under fire, or in church, and he could compel sleep to come to him when and where he pleased. He cared as little for good quarters as a mountain hunter, and he was as abstemious as a Red Indian on the warpath. He lived as plainly as the men, and often shared their rations. The majority of the cavalry were better mounted, and many of his officers were better dressed. He was not given to addressing his troops, either in mass or as individuals. His praises he reserved for his official reports, and then he was generous. In camp he was as silent as the Sphinx, and he never posed except in action as the commander of an army. Off duty he was the gentlest and most unpretentious of men, and the most approachable of generals. He was always scrupulously polite, and the private soldier who asked him a question might be sure of a most courteous reply. But there was no man with whom it was less safe to take liberties, and where duty was concerned he became a different being. The gentle tones grew curt and peremptory, and the absent demeanour gave place to a most purposeful energy. His vigilance was marvellous, his eye was everywhere. He let nothing pass without his personal scrutiny. The unfortunate officer accused of indolence or neglect found the shy and quiet professor transformed into the most implacable of masters. No matter how high the rank of the offender, the crime met with the punishment it deserved. The scouts compared him with Lee. The latter was so genial that it was a pleasure to report to him. Jackson cross-questioned them on every detail, treating them as a lawyer does a hostile witness, and his keen blue eyes seemed to search their very souls. Nor did the men escape when they misbehaved. Ashby's cavalry were reprimanded in general orders for their indiscipline at Middletown, and again at Port Republic, and if either officer or regiment displeased the general, it was duly mentioned in his published reports. But the troops knew that their grave leader, so uncommunicative in camp and so unrelenting to misconduct, was constantly occupied with their well-being. They knew that he spared them when opportunity offered, as he never spared himself. His camaraderie was expressed in something more than words. The hospitals constructed in the valley excited the admiration even of the Federals, and Jackson's wounded were his first care. Whatever it might cost the army, the ambulances must be got safely away, and the sick and disabled soldiers transferred to their own people. But at the same time, the troops had long since learned that, as administered by Jackson, the military code was a stern reality. They had seen men shot for striking their officers, and they knew that for insubordination or disobedience it was idle to plead excuse. They had thought their general harsh and even cruel, but as their experience increased, they recognized the wisdom of his severity, and when they looked upon that kindly face, grave and determined as it was, they realized how closely his firmness was allied to tenderness. They had learned how highly he esteemed them. Once, in his 12 months of command, he had spoken from his heart. When, on the heights near Centreville, he bade farewell to his old brigade, his pride in their achievements had broken through the barriers of his reserve, and his ringing words had not yet been forgotten. If he was swift to blame, his general orders and official dispatches gave full credit to every gallant action, and each man felt himself a hero because his general so regarded him. They had learned, too, that Jackson's commendation was worth having. They had seen him in action, the coolest of them all, riding along the line of battle with as much composure as if the hail of bullets was no more than summer rain. They had seen him far in advance of the charging lines, cheering them to the pursuit, and they knew the tremendous vigour of his flank attacks. But it was not only confidence in the skill of their commander that inspired the troops. It was impossible not to admire the man who, after a sleepless night, a long march, and hard fighting, would say to his officers, "We must push on! We must push on!" as unconcernedly as if his muscles were of steel and hunger an unknown sensation. Such fortitude was contagious. The men caught something of his resolution, of his untiring energy, and his unhesitating audacity. The regiments which drove Banks to the Potomac were very different from those that crawled to Romney through the blinding sleet, or that fell back with the loss of 1/6 their number from the Kernstown Ridge. It has been related of Jackson that when he had once made up his mind, he seemed to discard all idea of defeat and to regard the issue as assured. A man less open to the conviction that he was beaten could not be imagined. To this frame of mind he brought his soldiers. Jackson's brigade at Bull Run, Jackson's division in the valley, Jackson's army corps later in the war, were all imbued with the characteristics of their leader. The exertions that he demanded of them seemed beyond the powers of mortal men, but with Jackson leading them, the troops felt themselves able to accomplish impossibilities. "I never saw one of Jackson's couriers approach," said Ewell, "without expecting an order to assault the North Pole." But had the order been given, neither Ewell nor the Valley troops would have questioned it. With the senior officers of his little army, Jackson's relations were in some instances less cordial than with the men. His staff was devoted to him, for they had learned to know him. At the beginning of the Valley campaign, some of them thought him mad. Before it was over, they believed him to be a genius. He lived with his military family on the most intimate terms, and his unfailing courtesy, his utter absence of self-assertion, his sweet temper, and his tactful consideration for others, no matter how humble their rank, were irresistible. On duty indeed, his staff officers fared badly. Tireless himself, regardless of all personal comforts, he seemed to think that others were fashioned in the same mould. After a weary day's marching or fighting, it was no unusual thing for him to send them for a ride of 30 or 40 miles through the night, and he gave the order with no more thought than if he were sending them with a message to the next tent. But off duty he was simply a personal friend, bent on making all things pleasant. "Never," says Dr. Hunter Maguire, "can I forget his kindness and gentleness to me when I was in great sorrow and trouble. He came to my tent and spent hours with me, comforting me in his simple, kindly Christian way, showing a depth of friendship and affection which can never be forgotten. There is no measuring the intensity with which the very soul of Jackson burned in battle. Out of it he was very gentle. Indeed, as I look back on the 2 years that I was daily, indeed hourly, with him, his gentleness as a man, his tenderness to those in trouble or affliction, the tenderness indeed of a woman, impress me more than his wonderful prowess as a warrior. It was with his generals and colonels that there was sometimes a lack of sympathy. Many of these were older than himself. Ewell and Whiting were his seniors in point of service, and there can be little doubt that it was sometimes a little hard to receive peremptory orders from a younger man. Jackson's secrecy was often irritating. Men who were oversensitive thought it implied a want of confidence. Those overburdened with dignity objected to being treated like the private soldiers, and those overconscious of superior wisdom were injured because their advice was not asked. Before the march to Richmond, there was much discontent. General Whiting, on reaching Staunton with his division, rode at once to Port Republic to report. "The distance," says General Imboden, "was 20 miles, and Whiting returned after midnight. He was in a towering passion, and declared that Jackson had treated him outrageously. I asked, 'How is that possible, General? He is very polite to everyone.' 'Oh, hang him! He was polite enough, but he didn't say one word about his plans. I finally asked him for orders, telling him what troops I had. He simply told me to go back to Staunton, and he would send me orders tomorrow. I haven't the slightest idea what they will be. I believe he has no more sense than my horse.' The orders, when they came, simply directed him to take his troops by railway to Gordonsville, through which they had passed 2 days before, and gave no reason whatever for the movement. General Whiting was not the only Confederate officer who was mystified. When the troops left the valley, not a single soul in the army, save Jackson alone, knew the object of their march. He had even gone out of his way to blind his most trusted subordinates. During the preceding afternoon, says Major Hotchkiss, he sent for me to his tent and asked me to bring maps of the country from Port Republic to Lexington, at the head of the valley, as he wished to examine them. I took the map to his tent, and for about half an hour we talked concerning the roads and streams, and points of offence and defence of that region, just as though he had in mind a march in that direction. After this interval had passed, he thanked me and said that that would do. About half an hour later he sent for me again, and remarked that there had been some fighting down about Richmond, referring, of course, to the Battle of 7 Pines, and that he would like to see the map of the field of the operations. I brought the maps of the district round Richmond, and we spent nearly twice as much time over those, talking about the streams, the roads, the condition of the country, and so forth. On retiring to my tent, I said to myself, "Old Jack is going to Richmond." Even the faithful Dabney was left in the dark till the troops had reached Meckham's station. There, calling him into a room in the hotel, the general locked the door and explained the object of his march. But it was under seal of secrecy, and Ewell, the second in command, complained to the chief of the staff that Jackson had gone off by train, leaving him without orders or even a hint of what was in the wind. In fact, a few days after the Battle of Port Republic, Ewell had sent some of his staff on leave of absence, telling them that large reinforcements were coming up and that the next move would be to beat up Banks' quarters about Strasbourg. When Jackson was informed of the irritation of his generals, he merely smiled and said, "If I can deceive my own friends, I can make certain of deceiving the enemy." Nothing shook his faith in Frederick the Great's maxim, which he was fond of quoting. "If I thought my coat knew my plans, I would take it off and burn it." An anecdote told by one of his brigadiers illustrates his reluctance to say more than necessary. Previous to the march to Richmond, this officer met Jackson riding through Staunton. "Colonel," said the general, "have you received the order?" "No, sir." "Want you to march." "When, sir?" "Now." "Which way?" "Get in the cars. Go with Lawton." "How must I send my train and the battery?" "By the road." "Well, General, I hate to ask questions, but it is impossible to send my wagons off without knowing which road to send them." "Oh," laughing, "send them by the road the others go." At last, when they saw how constant fortune was to their reticent leader, his subordinates ceased to complain, but unfortunately there was another source of trouble. Jackson had no regard whatever for persons. Reversing the usual procedure, he held that the choleric word of the soldier was rank blasphemy in the captain. The higher the rank of the offender, the more severe, in his opinion, should be the punishment. Not only did he hold that he who would rule others must himself set the example of punctiliousness, but that to whom much is given, from him much is to be expected. Honour and promotion fall to the lot of the officer. His name is associated in dispatches with the valorous deeds of his command, while the private soldier fights on unnoticed in the crowd. To his colonels, therefore, Jackson was a strict master, and stricter to his generals. If he had reason to believe that his subordinates were indolent or disobedient, he visited their shortcomings with a heavy hand. No excuse availed. Arrest and report followed immediately on detection, and if the cure was rude, the plague of incompetency was radically dealt with. Spirited young soldiers, proud of their high rank and in no way underrating their own capacity, rebelled against such discipline, and the knowledge that they were closely watched, that their omissions would be visited on their heads with unfaltering severity, sometimes created a barrier between them and their commander. But it was only wilful disobedience or actual insubordination that roused Jackson's wrath. "If he found in an officer," says Dabney, "a hearty and zealous purpose to do all his duty, he was the most tolerant and gracious of superiors, overlooking blunders and mistakes with unbounded patience, and repairing them through his own exertions, without even a sign of vexation." The delay at the bridge on the morning of Port Republic, so fatal to his design of crushing Fremont, caused no outburst of wrath. He received his adjutant general's report with equanimity, regarding the accident as due to the will of Providence, and therefore to be accepted without complaint. Whether the nobler side of Jackson's character had a share in creating the confidence which his soldiers already placed in him must be a matter of conjecture. It was well known in the ranks that he was superior to the frailties of human nature, that he was as thorough a Christian as he was a soldier, that he feared the world as little as he did the enemy. In all things he was consistent. His sincerity was as clear as the noonday sun, and his faith as firmly rooted as the Massanuttons. Publicly and privately, in official dispatches and in ordinary conversation, the success of his army was ascribed to the Almighty. Every victory, as soon as opportunity offered, was followed by the order, "The chaplains will hold divine service in their respective regiments." "The general commanding," ran the order after Winchester, "would warmly express to the officers and men under his command his joy in their achievements, and his thanks for their brilliant gallantry in action, and their patient obedience under the hardships of forced marches, often more painful to the brave soldier than the danger of battle." The explanation of the severe exertions to which the commanding general called the army, which were endured by them with such cheerful confidence in him, is now given in the victory of yesterday. He receives this proof of their confidence in the past with pride and gratitude, and asks only a similar confidence in the future. But his chief duty of today and that of the army is to recognize devoutly the hand of a protecting providence in the brilliant successes of the last 3 days, which have given us the results of a great victory without great losses, and to make the oblation of our thanks to God for his service to us and our country in heartfelt acts of religious worship. For this purpose the troops will remain in camp today, suspending as far as possible all military exercises, and the chaplains of regiments will hold divine service in their several charges at 4:00 p.m. Whenever it was possible, Sunday was always set apart for a day of rest, and the claims of the day were seldom altogether disregarded. On the morning of Cross Keys, it is related that a large portion of Elzey's brigade were at service, and that the crash of the enemy's artillery interrupted the thirdly of the chaplain's sermon. It has been sometimes asserted that Jackson was of the same type as the saints militant who followed Cromwell, who, when they were not slaughtering their enemies, would expound the harsh tenets of their unlovely creed to the grim circle of belted Ironsides. He has been described as taking the lead at religious meetings, as distributing tracts from tent to tent, as acting as aide-de-camp to his chaplains, and as consigning to perdition all those whose doxy was not his doxy. Nothing is further from the truth. His views of each denomination, says his wife, had been obtained from itself, not from its opponents. Hence he could see excellencies in all. Even of the Roman Catholic Church he had a much more favourable impression than most Protestants, and he fraternized with all evangelical denominations. During a visit to New York one Sabbath morning, we chanced to find ourselves at the door of an Episcopal church at the hour of worship. He proposed that we should enter, and as it was a day for the celebration of the Communion, he remained for that service, and it was with the utmost reverence and solemnity that he walked up the chancel and knelt to receive the elements. Jackson, then, was by no means imbued with the belief that the Presbyterian was the one true church, and that all others were in error. Nor did he attempt in the very slightest degree to usurp the functions of his chaplains. Although he invariably went to sleep during their sermons, he was deeply interested in their endeavours, and gave them all the assistance in his power. But he no more thought of taking their duties on himself than of interfering with the treatment of the men in hospital. He spoke no words in season, even to his intimates. He had no message for them. Where religion was concerned, so long as duly qualified instructors were available, he conceived it his business to listen and not to teach. Morning and evening prayers were the rule at his headquarters, but if any of his staff chose to remain absent, the general made no remark. Yet all suspicion of indifference to vice was effectually removed. Nothing ungenerous or unclean was said in his presence without incurring his displeasure, always unmistakably expressed, and although he made no parade of his piety, he was far too manly to hide it. Yet he was never a prominent figure at the camp services. Rather than occupy a conspicuous place, he would seat himself amongst the privates, and the only share he took in directing the proceedings was to beckon men to the seats that respect had left empty beside him. Those who picture him as an enthusiastic fanatic, invading like the Puritan dragoons the pulpits of the chaplains, and leading the devotions of his troops with the same fervour that he displayed in battle, have utterly misread his character. The humblest soldier in the Confederate army was not more modest and unassuming than Stonewall Jackson. Chapter 13. The 7 Days, Gaines' Mill, 1862. The region to which the interest now shifts is very different from the valley. From the terraced banks of the Rappahannock, 60 miles north of Richmond, to the shining reaches of the James, where the capital of the Confederacy stands high on her 7 hills, the lowlands of Virginia are clad with luxuriant vegetation. The roads and railways run through endless avenues of stately trees. The shadows of the giant oaks lie far across the rivers, and ridge and ravine are mantled with the unbroken foliage of the primeval forest. In this green wilderness, the main armies were involved. But despite the beauty of broad rivers and sylvan solitudes, gay with gorgeous blossoms and fragrant with aromatic shrubs, the eastern, or tidewater, counties of Virginia had little to recommend them as a theatre of war. They were sparsely settled. The wooden churches, standing lonely in the groves where the congregations hitched their horses, the solitary taverns, half inns and half stores, the courthouses of the county justices, with a few wooden cottages clustered round them, were poor substitutes for the market towns of the Shenandoah. Here and there on the higher levels, surrounded by coppice and lawn, by broad acres of corn and clover, the manors of the planters gave life and brightness to the landscape. But the men were fighting in Lee's ranks. Their families had fled to Richmond, and these hospitable homes showed signs of poverty and neglect. Neither food nor forage was to be drawn from the country, and the difficulties of supply and shelter were not the worst obstacles to military operations. At this season of the year, the climate and the soil were persistent foes. The roads were mere tracks, channels which served as drains for the interminable forest. The deep meadows, fresh and green to the eye, were damp and unwholesome camping grounds. Turgid streams, like the Chickahominy and its affluents, winding sluggishly through rank jungles, spread in swamp and morass across the valleys, and the languid atmosphere, surcharged with vapour, was redolent of decay. Through this malarious region, the Federal Army had been pushing its slow way forward for more than 6 weeks, and 105,000 men, accompanied by a large siege train, lay entrenched within sight of the spires of Richmond. 30,000 were north of the Chickahominy, covering the York River Railway and waiting for the coming of McDowell. The remainder, from Woodbury's Bridge to the Charles City Road, occupied the line of breastworks which stood directly east of the beleaguered city. So nearly was the prize within their grasp that the church bells, and even the clocks striking the hour, were heard in the camps, and at Mechanicsville Bridge, watched by a picket, stood a signpost which bore the legend, "To Richmond, 41 2 miles." The sentries who paced that beat were fortunate. For the next 2 years, they could boast that no Federal soldier, except as a prisoner, had stood so close as they had to the rebel stronghold. But during these weeks in June, not a single soul in McClellan's army, and few in the Confederacy, suspected that the flood of invasion had reached high water mark. Richmond, gazing night after night at the red glow which throbbed on the eastern vault, the reflection of countless campfires, and listening with strained ears to the far-off call of hostile bugles, seemed in perilous case. No formidable position protected the approaches. Earthworks, indeed, were in process of construction, but, although the left flank at New Bridge was covered by the Chickahominy, the right was protected by no natural obstacle, as had been the case at Yorktown, and the lines occupied no commanding site. Nor had the government been able to assemble an army of a strength sufficient to man the whole front. Lee, until Jackson joined him, commanded no more than 72,500 men. Of these, a large portion were new troops, and their numbers had been reduced by the 7,000 dispatched under Whiting to the valley. But if the Federal army was far superior in numbers, it was not animated by an energy in proportion to its strength. The march from the White House was more sluggish than the current of the Chickahominy. From May 17 to June 26, the Army of the Valley had covered 400 miles. Within the same period, the Army of the Potomac had covered 20. It is true that the circumstances were widely different. McClellan had in front of him the lines of Richmond, and his advance had been delayed by the rising of the Chickahominy. He had fought a hard fight at 7 Pines, and the constant interference of Jackson had kept him waiting for McDowell. But at the same time he had displayed an excess of caution which was perfectly apparent to his astute opponent. He had made no attempt to use his superior numbers, and Lee had come to the conclusion that the attack on Richmond would take the same form as the attack on Yorktown: the establishment of great batteries, the massing of heavy ordnance, and all the tedious processes of a siege. He read McClellan like an open book. He had personal knowledge both of his capacity and character, for they had served together on the same staff in the Mexican War. He knew that his young adversary was a man of undoubted ability, of fascinating address, and of courage that was never higher than when things were at their worst. But these useful qualities were accompanied by marked defects. His will was less powerful than his imagination. Bold in conception, he was terribly slow in execution. When his good sense showed him the opportunity, his imagination whispered, "Suppose the enemy has reserves of which I know nothing. Is it not more prudent to wait until I receive more accurate information?" And so I dare not inevitably waited on I would. He forgot that in war it is impossible for a general to be absolutely certain. It is sufficient, according to Napoleon, if the odds in his favour are 3-2, and if he cannot discover from the attitude of his enemy what the odds are, he is unfitted for supreme command. Before Yorktown, McClellan's 5 army corps had been held in check, first by 15,000 men, then by 58,000, protected by earthworks of feeble profile. The fort at Gloucester Point was the key of the Confederate lines. McClellan, however, although a division was actually under orders to move against it, appears to have been unwilling to risk a failure. The channel of the York was thus closed both to his transports and the gunboats, and he did nothing whatever to interfere with Johnston's long line of communications, which passed at several points within easy reach of the river bank. Nor had he been more active since he had reached West Point. Except for a single expedition which had dispersed a Confederate division near Hanover Courthouse north of the Chickahominy, he had made no aggressive movement. He had never attempted to test the strength of the fortifications of Richmond, to hinder their construction, or to discover their weak points. His urgent demands for reinforcements had appeared in the northern newspapers, and those newspapers had found their way to Richmond. From the same source, the Confederates were made aware that he believed himself confronted by an army far larger than his own, and when, on the departure of Whiting's division for the Valley, he refused to take advantage of the opportunity to attack Lee's diminished force, it became abundantly clear, if further proof were wanting, that much might be ventured against so timid a commander. From his knowledge of his adversary's character, and still more from his attitude, Lee had little difficulty in discovering his intentions. McClellan, on the other hand, failed to draw a single correct inference. And yet the information at his disposal was sufficient to enable him to form a fair estimate of how things stood in the Confederate camp. He had been attacked at 7 Pines, but not by superior numbers, and it was hardly likely that the enemy had not employed their whole available strength in this battle. Otherwise, their enterprise was insensate. Furthermore, it was clearly to the interests of the Confederates to strike at his army before McDowell could join him. They had not done so, and it was therefore probable that they did not feel themselves strong enough to do so. It is true that he was altogether misled by the intelligence supplied as to the garrison of Richmond by his famous detective staff. 200,000 was the smallest number which the chief agent would admit, but that McClellan should have relied on the estimate of these untrained observers rather than on the evidence furnished by the conduct of the enemy is but a further proof that he lacked all power of deduction. It may well be questioned whether he was anxious at heart to measure swords with Lee. His knowledge of his adversary, whose reputation for daring, for ability, for strength of purpose, had been higher than any other in the old army, must needs have had a disturbing influence on his judgment. Against an enemy he did not know, McClellan might have acted with resolution. Face to face with Lee, it can hardly be doubted that the weaker will was dominated by the stronger. Vastly different were their methods of war. McClellan made no effort whatever either to supplement or to corroborate the information supplied by his detectives. Since he had reached West Point, his cavalry had done little. Lee, on the other hand, had found means to ascertain the disposition of his adversary's troops, and had acquired ample information of the measures which had been taken to protect the right wing, north of the Chickahominy, the point he had determined to attack. Early on June 12th, with 1,200 horsemen and a section of artillery, Stuart rode out on an enterprise of a kind which at that time was absolutely unique, and which will keep his memory green so long as cavalry is used in war. Carefully concealing his march, he encamped that night near Taylorsville, 22 miles north of Richmond, and far beyond the flank of the Federal entrenchments. June 13th. The next morning he turned eastward towards Hanover Courthouse. Here he drove back a picket, and his advanced guard, with the loss of one officer, soon afterwards charged down a squadron of regulars. A few miles to the southeast, near Old Church, the enemy's outposts were finally dispersed, and then, instead of halting, the column pushed on into the very heart of the district occupied by the Federals, and soon found itself in rear of their encampments. Stuart had already gained important information. He had learned that McClellan's right flank extended but a short way north of the Chickahominy, that it was not fortified, and that it rested on neither swamp nor stream, and this was what Lee had instructed him to discover. But it was one thing to obtain the information, another to bring it back. If he returned by the road he had come, it was probable he would be cut off, for the enemy was thoroughly roused, and the South Anna River, unfordable from recent rains, rendered a detour to the north impracticable. To the mouth and west of him lay the Federal army, some of the infantry camps not 5 miles distant. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He could hardly reach Hanover Courthouse before dark, and he might find it held by the enemy. To escape from the dilemma, he determined on a plan of extraordinary daring, which involved nothing less than the passage of the Chickahominy in rear of the enemy and a circuit of the entire Federal army. The audacity of the design proved the salvation of his command. The enemy had assembled a strong force of both cavalry and infantry at Hanover Courthouse, under Stuart's father-in-law, General Cooke, but misled by the reports brought in and doubtless perplexed by the situation, the latter pursued but slowly and halted for the night at Old Church. Stuart, meanwhile, had reached Tunstall's station on the York River Railway, picking up prisoners at every step. Here, routing the guard, he tore up the rails, destroyed a vast amount of stores and many wagons, broke down the telegraph and burnt the railway bridge, his men regaling themselves on the luxuries which were found in the well-stored establishments of the sutlers. 2 squadrons, dispatched to Garlick's Landing on the Pamunkey, set fire to 2 transports, and rejoined with a large number of prisoners, horses, and mules. Then, led by troopers who were natives of the country, the column marched southeast by the Williamsburg Road, moving further and still further away from Richmond. The moon was full, and as the troops passed by the forest farms, the women, running to the wayside, wept with delight at the unexpected apparition of the grey jackets, and old men showered blessings on the heads of their gallant countrymen. At Tallysville, 8 miles east, Stuart halted for 3 hours, and shortly after midnight, just as a Federal infantry brigade reached Tunstall Station in hot pursuit, he turned off by a country road to the Chickahominy. June 14th. At Forge Bridge, where he arrived at daylight, he should have found a ford, but the river had overflowed its banks and was full of floating timber. Colonel Fitzhugh Lee, not the least famous member of a famous family, accompanied by a few men, swam his horse at imminent peril over to the other bank. But although he recrossed the swollen waters in the same manner, the daring young officer had to report that the passage was impracticable. It was already light. The enemy would soon be up, and the capture of the whole column seemed absolutely certain. Hitherto the men, exhilarated by the complete success of the adventure, had borne themselves as gaily as if they were riding through the streets of Richmond. But the danger of their situation was now forcibly impressed upon them, and the whole command became grave and anxious. Stuart alone was unmoved, and at this juncture one of his scouts informed him that the skeleton of an old bridge spanned the stream about a mile below. An abandoned warehouse furnished the materials for a footway over which the troopers passed, holding the bridles of their horses as they swam alongside. Half the column thus crossed, while the remainder strengthened the bridge so as to permit the passage of the artillery. By 1 o'clock the whole force was over the Chickahominy, unmolested by the enemy, of whom only small parties, easily driven back by the rear guard, had made their appearance. 35 miles now to Richmond, in rear of the left wing of the Northern Army, and within range, for some portion of the march, of the gunboats on the James River. Burning the bridge, with a wave of the hand to the Federal horsemen who covered the heights above, Stuart plunged into the woods, and without further misadventure brought his troops at sunset to the neighbourhood of Charles City Courthouse. Leaving his men sleeping after 36 hours in the saddle, he rode to Richmond to report to Lee. June 15th. Before dawn on the 15th, after covering another 30 miles, over a road which was patrolled by the enemy, he reached headquarters. His squadrons followed, marching at midnight, and bringing with them 165 prisoners and 260 captured horses and mules. This extraordinary expedition, which not only effected the destruction of a large amount of federal property and broke up for the time being their line of supplies, but acquired information of the utmost value and shook the confidence of the North in McClellan's generalship, was accomplished with the loss of one man. These young Virginia soldiers marched 110 miles in less than 2 days. There was something sublime, says Stuart, in the implicit confidence and unquestioning trust of the rank and file in a leader guiding them straight, apparently, into the very jaws of the enemy, every step appearing to them to diminish the hope of extrication. Nor was the influence of their achievement on the morale of the whole Confederate army the least important result attained. A host of over 100,000 men, which had allowed a few squadrons to ride completely round it, by roads which were within hearing of its bugles, was no longer considered a formidable foe. On receiving Stuart's information, Lee drew up the plan of operations which had been imparted to Jackson on the 22nd. Confederate Army Organization, Longstreet 9,000, A.P. Hill 14,000, Magruder 13,000, Huger 9,000, Holmes 6,500, D.H. Hill 10,000, Jackson 18,500, Cavalry 3,000, Reserve Artillery 3,000, total 86,500. June 24th. On the night of June 24th, the whole of these troops, with the exception of the Valley Army, were south of the Chickahominy, holding the earthworks which protected Richmond. Less than 2 miles eastward, strongly entrenched, lay 4 of McClellan's army corps, in round numbers 75,000 officers and men. To attack this force, even after Jackson's arrival, was to court disaster. The right was protected by the Chickahominy, the left rested on White Oak Swamp, a network of sluggish streams and impassable swamps, screened everywhere by tangled thickets. It needed not the presence of the siege ordnance, placed on the most commanding points within the lines, to make such a position absolutely impregnable. North of the Chickahominy, however, the Federals were less favourably situated. The 5th Army Corps, 25,000 strong, under General Fitzjohn Porter, had been pushed forward, stretching a hand to McDowell and protecting the railway in the direction of Mechanicsville, and although the tributaries of the Chickahominy, running in from the north, afforded a series of positions, the right flank of these positions, resting, as Stuart had ascertained, on no natural obstacle, was open to a turning movement. Furthermore, in rear of the 5th Corps, and at an oblique angle to the front, ran the line of supply, the railway to West Point. If Porter's right were turned, the Confederates, threatening the railway, would compel McClellan to detach largely to the north bank of the Chickahominy in order to recover or protect the line. On the north bank of the Chickahominy, therefore, Lee's attention had been for some time fixed. Here was his adversary's weak point, and a sudden assault on Porter, followed up, if necessary, by an advance against the railway, would bring McClellan out of his entrenchments and force him to fight at a disadvantage. To ensure success, however, in the attack on Porter, It was necessary to concentrate an overwhelming force on the north bank, and this could hardly be done without so weakening the force which held the Richmond lines that it would be unable to resist the attack of the 75,000 men who faced it. If McClellan, while Lee was fighting Porter, boldly threw forward the great army he had on the south bank, the rebel capital might be the reward of his resolution. The danger was apparent to all, but Lee resolved to risk it, and his audacity has not escaped criticism. It has been said that he deliberately disregarded the contingency of McClellan either advancing on Richmond or reinforcing Porter. The truth is, however, that neither Lee nor those generals about him who knew McClellan were in the least apprehensive that their overcautious adversary, if the attack were sudden and well sustained, would either see or utilize his opportunity. From Hannibal to Moltke, there has been no great captain who has neglected to study the character of his opponent, and who did not trade on the knowledge thus acquired, and it was this knowledge which justified Lee's audacity. The real daring of the enterprise lay in the inferiority of the Confederate armament. Muskets and shotguns, still carried by a large part of the army, were ill-matched against rifles of the most modern manufacture, while the smooth-bore field pieces, with which at least half the artillery was equipped, possessed neither the range nor the accuracy of the rifled ordnance of the Federals. That Lee's study of the chances had not been patient and exhaustive it is impossible to doubt. He was no hare-brained leader, but a profound thinker, following the highest principles of the military art. That he had weighed the disconcerting effect which the sudden appearance of the victorious Jackson, with an army of unknown strength, would produce upon McClellan goes without saying. He had omitted no precaution to render the surprise complete, and although the defences of Richmond were still too weak to resist a resolute attack, Magruder, the same officer who had so successfully imposed upon McClellan at Yorktown, was such a master of artifice that with 28,000 men and the reserve artillery he might be relied upon to hold Richmond until Porter had been disposed of. The remainder of the army, 2,000 of Stuart's cavalry, the divisions of Longstreet and the two Hills, 35,000 men all told, crossing to the north bank of the Chickahominy and combining with the 18,500 under Jackson, would be sufficient to crush the Federal right. The initial operations, however, were of a somewhat complicated nature. 4 bridges crossed the river on Lee's left. A little more than a mile and a half from Mechanicsville Bridge upstream is Meadow Bridge, and 5.5 miles further up is another passage at the half-sink, afterward called Winston's Bridge. 3.5 miles below Mechanicsville Bridge is New Bridge. The northern approaches to Mechanicsville, Meadow, and New Bridge were in possession of the Federals, and it was consequently no simple operation to transfer the troops before Richmond from one bank of the Chickahominy to the other. Only Mechanicsville and Meadow bridges could be used. Winston's Bridge was too far from Richmond, for if Longstreet and the two Hills were to cross at that point, not only would Magruder be left without support during their march, but McClellan, warned by his scouts, would receive long notice of the intended blow and have ample time for preparation. To surprise Porter, to give McClellan no time for reflection, and at the same time to gain a position which would bring the Confederates operating on the north bank into close and speedy communication with Magruder on the south, another point of passage must be chosen. The position would be the one commanding New Bridge, for the Confederate earthworks, held by Magruder, ran due south from that point. But Porter was already in possession of the coveted ground, with strong outposts at Mechanicsville. To secure, then, the 2 centre bridges was the first object. This, it was expected, would be achieved by the advance of the Valley Army, aided by a brigade from the half-sink, against the flank and rear of the Federals at Mechanicsville. Then, as soon as the enemy fell back, Longstreet and the two Hills would cross the river by the Meadow and Mechanicsville bridges and strike Porter in front while Jackson attacked his right. A victory would place the Confederates in possession of New Bridge, and the troops north of the Chickahominy would be then in close communication with Magruder. Lee's orders were as follows. Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, June 24, 1862. General Orders, Number 75. I. General Jackson's command will proceed tomorrow, June 25th, from Ashland towards the Mary Oaks Church, and encamp at some convenient point west of the Central Railroad. Branch's brigade of A.P. Hill's division will also, tomorrow evening, take position on the Chickahominy near Half Sink. At 3 o'clock Thursday morning, 26th instant, General Jackson will advance on the road leading to Pole Green Church, communicating his march to General Branch, who will immediately cross the Chickahominy and take the road leading to Mechanicsville. As soon as the movements of these columns are discovered, General A.P. Hill, with the rest of his division, will cross the Chickahominy at Meadow Bridge and move direct upon Mechanicsville. To aid his advance, the heavy batteries on the Chickahominy will at the proper time open upon the batteries at Mechanicsville. The enemy being driven from Mechanicsville and the passage of the bridge being opened, General Longstreet, with his division and that of General D.H. Hill, will cross the Chickahominy at or near that point. General D.H. Hill moving to the support of General Jackson, and General Longstreet supporting General A.P. Hill, the four divisions keeping in communication with each other, and moving en echelon on separate roads if practicable. The left division in advance, with skirmishers and sharpshooters extending in their front, will sweep down the Chickahominy and endeavour to drive the enemy from his position above New Bridge, General Jackson bearing well to his left, turning Beaver Dam Creek and taking the direction towards Cold Harbor. They will then press forward towards the York River Railroad, closing upon the enemy's rear and forcing him down the Chickahominy. An advance of the enemy towards Richmond will be prevented by vigorously following his rear and crippling and arresting his progress. The divisions under Generals Huger and Magruder will hold their position in front of the enemy against attack and make such demonstrations on Thursday as to discover his operations. Should opportunity offer, the feint will be converted into a real attack. 3rd. General Stuart, with the 1st, 4th and 9th Virginia Cavalry, the cavalry of Cobb's Legion and the Jeff Davis Legion, will cross the Chickahominy tomorrow, Wednesday, June 25th, and take position to the left of General Jackson's line of march. The main body will be held in reserve, with scouts well extended to the front and left. General Stuart will keep General Jackson informed of the movements of the enemy on his left, and will cooperate with him in his advance. June 25th. On the 25th, Longstreet and the two Hills moved towards the bridges, and although during the movement McClellan drove back Magruder's pickets to their trenches and pushed his own outposts nearer Richmond, Lee held firmly to his purpose. As a matter of fact, there was little to be feared from McClellan. With a profound belief in the advantages of defensive and in the strength of a fortified position, he expected nothing less than that the Confederates would leave the earthworks they had so laboriously constructed and deliberately risk the perils of an attack. He seems to have had little idea that in the hands of a skilful general, entrenchments may form a pivot of operations, the means whereby he covers his most vulnerable point, holds the enemy in front, and sets his main body free for offensive action. Yet McClellan was by no means easy in his mind. He knew Jackson was approaching. He knew his communications were threatened. Fugitive Negroes, who, as usual, either exaggerated or lied, had informed him that the Confederates had been largely reinforced and that Beauregard, with a portion of the Western Army, had arrived in Richmond. But that his right wing was in danger he had not the faintest suspicion. He judged Lee by himself. Such a plan as leaving a small force to defend Richmond and transferring the bulk of the army to join Jackson he would have at once rejected as overdaring. If attack came at all, he expected that it would come by the south bank, and he was so far from anticipating that an opportunity for offensive action might be offered to himself that, on the night of the 25th, he sent word to his corps commanders that they were to regard their entrenchments as the true field of battle. June 26th, 3 a.m. Lee's orders left much to Jackson. The whole operation which Lee had planned hinged upon his movements. On the morning of the 24th, he was at Beaver Dam Station. The same night he was to reach Ashland, 18 miles distant as the crow flies. On the night of the 25th, he was to halt near the Slash Church, just west of the Virginia Central Railway, and 6 miles east of Ashland. At 3 o'clock, however, on the morning of the 26th, the Army of the Valley was still at Ashland, and it was not till 9 that it crossed the railroad. 10:30 a.m. Branch, on hearing that Jackson was at last advancing, passed the Chickahominy by Winston's Bridge, and driving Federal pickets before him, moved on Mechanicsville. General A.P. Hill was meanwhile near Meadow Bridge, waiting until the advance of Jackson and Branch should turn the flank of the Federal force which blocked his passage. 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., hearing nothing from his colleagues and apprehensive that longer delay might hazard the failure of the whole plan, he ordered his advanced guard to seize the bridge. The enemy, already threatened in rear by Branch, at once fell back. Hill followed the retiring pickets towards Beaver Dam Creek, and after a short march of 3 miles found himself under fire of the Federal artillery. Porter had occupied a position about 2 miles above New Bridge. The rest of the Confederate army was already crossing the Chickahominy, and although there was no sign of Jackson and the enemy's front was strong, protected by a long line of batteries, Hill thought it necessary to order an attack. A message from Lee, ordering him to postpone all further movement, arrived too late. There was no artillery preparation, and the troops, checked unexpectedly by a wide abattis, were repulsed with terrible slaughter, the casualties amounting to nearly 2,000 men. The Union loss was 360. 4:30 p.m. Jackson, about 4:30 p.m., before this engagement had begun, had reached Hundley's Corner, 3 miles north of the Federal position, but separated from it by dense forest and the windings of the creek. On the opposite bank was a detachment of Federal infantry, supported by artillery. 6 p.m. 2 guns, accompanied by the advanced guard, sufficed to drive this force to the shelter of the woods, and then, establishing his outposts, Jackson ordered his troops to bivouac. It has been asserted by more than one Southern general that the disaster at Beaver Dam Creek was due to Jackson's indifferent tactics, and at first sight the bare facts would seem to justify the verdict. He had not reached his appointed station on the night of the 25th, and on the 26th he was 5 hours behind time. He should have crossed the Virginia Central Railway at sunrise, but at 9 o'clock he was still 3 miles distant. His advance against the Federal right flank and rear should have been made in cooperation with the remainder of the army. But his whereabouts was unknown when Hill attacked, and although the cannonade was distinctly heard at Hundley's Corner, he made no effort to lend assistance, and his troops were encamping when their comrades, not 3 miles away, were rushing forward to the assault. There would seem to be some grounds, then, for the accusation that his delay thwarted General Lee's design, some reason for the belief that the victor of the Valley Campaign, on his first appearance in combination with the main army, had proved a failure, and that his failure was in those very qualities of swiftness and energy to which he owed his fame. General D. H. Hill has written that Jackson's genius never shone when he was under the command of another. It seemed then to be shrouded or paralyzed. MacGregor on his native heath was not more different from MacGregor in prison than was Jackson his own master from Jackson in a subordinate position. This was the keynote to his whole character. The hooded falcon cannot strike the quarry. The reader who has the heart to follow this chronicle to the end will assuredly find reason to doubt the acumen, however he may admire the eloquence, of Jackson's brother-in-law. When he reads of the Second Manassas, of Harper's Ferry, of Sharpsburg, and of Chancellorsville, he will recall this statement with astonishment, and it will not be difficult to show that Jackson conformed as closely to the plans of his commander at Mechanicsville as elsewhere. The machinery of war seldom runs with the smoothness of clockwork. The course of circumstances can never be exactly predicted. Unforeseen obstacles may render the highest skill and the most untiring energy of no avail. And it may be well to point out that the task which was assigned to Jackson was one of exceeding difficulty. In the first place, his march of 28 miles from Fredericks-Hall to Ashland on June 23rd, 24th and 25 was made over an unmapped country, unknown either to himself or to his staff, which had lately been in occupation of the Federals. Bridges had been destroyed and roads obstructed. The Valley Army had already marched far and fast, and although Dabney hints that inexperienced and sluggish subordinates were the chief cause of delay, there is hardly need to look so far for excuse. The march from Ashland to Hundley's Corner, 16 miles, was little less difficult. It was made in 2 columns, Whiting and the Stonewall Division, now under Winder, crossing the railway near Merry Oaks Church, Ewell moving by Shady Grove Church, but this distribution did not accelerate the march. The midsummer sun blazed fiercely down on the dusty roads. The dense woods on either hand shut out the air, and interruptions were frequent. The Federal cavalry held a line from Atlee's Station to near Hanover Courthouse. The 8th Illinois, over 700 strong, picketed all the woods between the Chickahominy and the Totopotomoy Creek. 2 other regiments prolonged the front to the Pamunkey, and near Hundley's Corner and Old Church were posted detachments of infantry. Skirmishing was constant. The Federal outposts contested every favourable position. Here and there the roads were obstructed by felled trees. A burned bridge over the Totopotomoy delayed the advance for a full hour, and it was some time before the enemy's force at Hundley's Corner was driven behind Beaver Dam Creek. At the Council of War, held on the 23rd, Lee had left it to Jackson to fix the date on which the operation against the Federal right should begin, and on the latter, deciding on the 26th, Longstreet had suggested that he should make more ample allowance for the difficulties that might be presented by the country and by the enemy, and give himself more time. Jackson had not seen fit to alter his decision, and it is hard to say that he was wrong. Had McClellan received notice that the Valley Army was approaching, a day's delay would have given him a fine opportunity. More than one course would have been open to him. He might have constructed formidable entrenchments on the north bank of the Chickahominy and have brought over large reinforcements of men and guns, or he might have turned the tables by a bold advance on Richmond. It was by no means inconceivable that if he detected Lee's intention and was given time to prepare, he might permit the Confederates to cross the Chickahominy, amuse them there with a small force, and hurl the rest of his army on the works which covered the southern capital. It is true that his caution was extreme, and to a mind which was more occupied with counting the enemy's strength than with watching for an opportunity, the possibility of assuming the offensive was not likely to occur. But, timid as he might be when no enemy was in sight, McClellan was constitutionally brave, and when the chimeras raised by an overactive imagination proved to be substantial dangers, he was quite capable of daring resolution. Time, therefore, was of the utmost importance to the Confederates. It was essential that Porter should be overwhelmed before McClellan realized the danger, and if Jackson, in fixing a date for the attack which would put a heavy tax on the marching powers of his men, already strained to the utmost, ran some risks, from a strategical point of view those risks were fully justified. In the second place, an operation such as that which Lee had devised is one of the most difficult manoeuvres which an army can be called upon to execute. According to Moltke, to unite 2 forces on the battlefield, starting at some distance apart, at the right moment, is the most brilliant feat of generalship. The slightest hesitation may ruin the combination. Haste is even more to be dreaded. There is always the danger that one wing may attack, or be attacked, while the other is still far distant, and either contingency may be fatal. The Valley Campaign furnishes more than one illustration. In their pursuit of Jackson, Shields and Fremont failed to cooperate at Strasburg, at Cross Keys, and at Port Republic, and greater generals than either Shields or Fremont have met with little better success in attempting the same manoeuvre. At both Eylau and Bautzen, Napoleon was deprived of decisive victory by his failure to ensure the cooperation of his widely separated columns. Jackson and A.P. Hill, on the morning of the 26th, were nearly 15 miles apart. Intercommunication at the outset was ensured by the brigade under Branch, but as the advance progressed and the enemy was met with, it became more difficult. The messengers riding from one force to the other were either stopped by the Federals, or were compelled to make long detours, and as they approached the enemy's position, neither Hill nor Jackson was informed of the whereabouts of the other. The truth is that the arrangements made by the Confederate headquarters staff were most inadequate. In the first place, the order of the 24th, instructing Jackson to start from Church at 3 a.m. on the 26th, and thus leading the other generals to believe that he would certainly be there at that hour, should never have been issued. When it was written, Jackson's advanced guard was at Beaver Dam Station, the rear brigades 15 miles behind, and to reach Church his force had to march 40 miles through an intricate country in possession of the enemy, and so little known that it was impossible to designate the route to be followed. To fix an hour of arrival so long in advance was worse than useless, and Jackson cannot be blamed if he failed to comply with the exact letter of a foolish order. As it was, so many of the bridges were broken, and so difficult was it to pass the fords, that if Dr. Dabney had not found in his brother, a planter of the neighbourhood, an efficient substitute for the guide headquarters should have provided, the Valley Army would have been not hours, but days too late. In the second place, the duty of keeping up communications should not have been left to Jackson, but have been seen to at headquarters. Jackson had with him only a few cavalry, and these few had not only to supply the necessary orderlies for the subordinate generals and the escorts for the artillery and trains, but to form his advanced guard, for Stuart's squadrons were on his left flank and not in his front. Moreover, his cavalry were complete strangers to the country, and there were no maps. In such circumstances, the only means of ensuring constant communication was to have detached 2 of Stuart's squadrons, who knew the ground, to establish a series of posts between Jackson's line of march and the Chickahominy, and to have detailed a staff officer whose sole duty would have been to furnish the commander-in-chief with hourly reports of the progress made to join the Valley Army.